In the Old Testament, there was a specific pattern that was used for building the tabernacle that Moses had to follow. It was a replica of what was in heaven, and it was to be a duplicate of what was going on until Christ came. When Christ came, he took his blood into that heavenly sanctuary and he placed it there, and that eliminated the need for the earthly tabernacle. But is there a pattern to this church then? If God is that diligent, is there a pattern? And I said there was. And I think that there are 4 elements to the building of the church. There's bedrock, there is foundations, there are the walls, and there are the ceilings.
He didn't die in vain.
So the very first thing, rudimentary to any building, and he does use buildings when he's talking to church so that we can understand the foundation has to be placed on something solid. It has to be placed on bedrock. The city where I grew up had very soft soil. It didn't have a rocky terrain around it, and they had to drive pylons well deep into the ground to make sure that they hit something solid, that they hit rock, upon which they could then build anything of any size, of any substance. Otherwise, it shifted and it could crack. Subsidence would be a problem. And so they had to go down to bedrock to be established. Well, the church is the same way. Jesus says in Matthew 7, he says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. He's saying if you're going to build a house, you've got to build it on a rock. And if we're going to build a church full of lively stones, which is human beings together, we need to have that church built on a solid foundation, placed on a rock. And that rock is the Word of God. It's not just the Logos of God. It's not just the printed Word, but it's the Word of God that comes with revelation. It's the Word of God that is breathed upon by the Spirit of God that brings light and understanding. When Jesus was asking the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" Peter responded and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus then said to him, "Peter, blessed are you, because no man has shown you this, but my Father in heaven has revealed it to you." And he said, "And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Upon this rock, not Peter specifically, although there is a connection between Peter and that, but specifically upon the revelation that Peter had of the living Word was Christ. And it's on the living Word that we build the rock of the church. It's on that foundation. Hebrews 4:12 tells us, "For the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." It's the Word of God that is there. It's the living Word of God. It's that Word breathed upon by the Spirit of God that is the bedrock for the church. If we don't have that, if we're missing that, we're like foolish people who are just building upon the sand. But once we have that firmly established, that that's the bedrock upon it, then you start to lay foundations. Your foundations are crucial for everything that goes above. They determine what can be built above ground and how high the building can go and the footprint of it by the size and the foundation.
you forget that He gave you His Son to be the only way? He is the only one.